Marangaria Nadu Yinjamara Ioromai Nadu Yinjamara Gadigo Nuremberg. In my language, Wiradjuri, good evening. I want to pay my respects to the Eora people and the land of the Gadigal people on who we're meeting tonight. Well, a year on from the start of the Russian invasion, America and its allies, including Australia, say they're standing behind Ukraine. But realistically, how long will that support last? Let's introduce our panel tonight. We're putting our questions to US State Senator Sarah McBride, who is in Australia for a major human rights conference coinciding with World Pride. Minister for Defence Industry, Pat Conroy, who has just been in Germany and the UK for discussions with defence counterparts. Ukrainian Ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Former General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, Sharan Burrow. And Professor at ANU's National Security College, George Brandis, who is also our High Commissioner to the UK. Welcome them all. Can Australia future-proof itself against a world of threat? Thank you for that welcome. I'm Stan Grant. It's great to be with you tonight. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. Tonight, we'll also be discussing our military ties with the US and UK, and we've got a terrific question on foreign spies. Who's into foreign spies? We've got a question on that a bit later. To get us started tonight, here's Jamie Hutchinson.
My question is, the war in the Ukraine, is there any way that it can end without one side simply backing down?
Ambassador.
Look, I would like to quote President Joe Biden, who was recently in Kyiv last week, and then he later spoke in Poland and he said, freedom is priceless and it's worth fighting for. And I think that was a very good reminder of what we are there in. We're there fighting for freedom, we're there fighting for our sovereignty, and for us it's an existential war. So that, for us, we don't really have any other option.
It's interesting you say that because Putin's also framing this as an existential war. He says this is a war to erase Russia. Does that mean that this is a war that is going to continue for some time?
Well, he got into this, and it's very difficult for him to get out because he declared an objective of taking over Ukraine, and he is not succeeding. We have been able to drive Russians out from 50% of the land that they have occupied from the outbreak of the war. And we've been getting the support from our allies. And what is important at this stage is, of course, how we can sustain that support for Ukraine. So, as we know, any kind of support must be substantive, comprehensive, and consistent. And if last year was for us to defend the country, this year it's about actually making sure that we can win. So what's important that support must be coming and must be goal-oriented in this respect. And I have to say that Ukraine and providing military equipment to Ukraine has bipartisan support in the Australian Parliament. And this is very important to have it.
I'll just go to Pat Conroy on that. How long does this support continue? We know that once conflicts begin, and we're talking about 1 year since the invasion, but we can go back to 2014, can't we, Ambassador, for as long as this conflict has been continuing in some form in Ukraine. So how long does Australia's support continue?
Stan, we'll be there as long as we're needed. That's the simple answer, but it's the truth. I've just come back from the Munich Security Conference, and the commitment from European, North American and the Australian ministers was paramount. If we draw this back to base principles, we stand opposed to an unprovoked, illegal and completely unprincipled invasion of a country. That invasion conducted by a member of the UN Security Council armed with nuclear weapons. So the attack on Ukraine was an attack on the international rules-based order, which Australia relies on to survive. We're a medium-sized country. The only way our security is guaranteed is everyone follows the international rules. And that's why we're there supporting the people of Ukraine in their brave struggle. That's why our bipartisan commitment has been to over $500 million worth of military assistance. That's why there's 70 Australian Defence Force personnel training Ukrainian soldiers right now in the United Kingdom. I talked to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Defence, about this last week, and he visited the trainers and the soldiers, and he was visibly moved, talking about the fact that he was watching Ukrainians who 3-4 weeks ago were civilians being trained to defend their motherland. And that's just remarkably moving for us. We should be proud of our contribution. We will be there as long as it takes, because this struggle is not just Ukraine versus Russia. It's a struggle for international rules-based order, freedom, and freedom from aggression.
Senator McBride, we also know that Joe Biden is saying the same thing, is Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, never, is something he said in a speech in Poland recently. What is the feeling in the United States about how long this could go on and the depth and level of US continued support?
Well, first off, it's an honor to be here with the ambassador to Australia from Ukraine. I think people across the world, particularly people who live in liberal democracies across the world, have been inspired by the way Ukrainians have responded to this illegal and unwarranted invasion of Ukraine. I think in the United States, the people within our country are committed to continuing to support the Ukrainian government in repelling Vladimir Putin's invasion. And I think it's really important to note, to the original question, that Vladimir Putin claiming that this is a war to protect Russia is propaganda, plain and simple. The president would call it malarkey. The reality is that if Ukrainian troops give up, that is the end of Ukraine as we know it. If Russian troops give up, they just go home. And so we have to reject the repeated propaganda by Putin that there is some sort of existential threat that Russia was facing from NATO or the West. That is just not true.
George Brandis, to go back to Jamie's question, which was that what does an end look like if one side doesn't back down? What does an end to this conflict look like? What would bring about an end to the war?
I think there are a number of potential scenarios that one can imagine. But there's really only one acceptable scenario, and that is that Russian forces be repelled from the occupation of Ukraine. Now, I mean, I agree with every word that Pat said. It's important from Australia's point of view that there was an absolutely seamless transition at the time of the election last year from Scott Morrison's early and strong support for Ukraine to Anthony Albanese's equally strong support for Ukraine. Both sides of politics in Australia have read this the same, and they have both read it right. And as Pat said, I mean, this is not just about Ukraine. This is the great threat in our generation to the international rules-based order. It's also a threat to the peace and stability of Europe by many orders of magnitude, the most extensive European land conflict since the Second World War. So there is only one acceptable outcome, even if it takes a long time, and it may, and that is for Russian forces to be driven from Ukraine.
Sharan Burrow, you've spent a lot of time in Europe, you've just returned. What was the feeling there about, and one of the things we can say about the war is it seems to have united a lot of countries and given greater strength to the NATO alliance. What was the sense there about how long this could go on and what Putin ultimately may be prepared to do for victory?
So the invasion sent shockwaves across Europe, I think around the world, but being in Europe and speaking at the very first peace rally, I can tell you that, you know, people were literally in shock. Europe, of course, was essentially a peace project. It was about bringing people together. It was about establishing territorial sovereignty, yes, but security more than that, within a rules-based order. And so the people there in Europe were initially shocked, but now fearful. If you go to those bordering countries, and I've travelled through most of them, you've not only got about 8 million refugees now, I haven't looked at the latest count, ambassador. You've got, you know, incredible numbers of displaced people. The solidarity's been extraordinary, helping all of the organisations and the government, but our trade unions in the Ukraine, to actually look after those displaced people. But now it's economic. The shocks have become economic, and they're now social, as, you know, the impact of inflation, global inflation rises. The energy prices are unbelievable. The price gouging by corporations, you know, making, you know, hay while people are literally struggling to survive. So now we're not just seeing a military threat and the fear of that, and it's serious when the last of the nuclear treaty unification has just gone with Russia's withdrawal. But it's actually now a threat to our common security in terms of people being able to live with dignity.
Stan, sorry, can I just jump in on those your 2 quick points? One, if you said to me a year ago that Sweden and Finland, 2 countries who've had centuries of non-alignment, would be applying to join NATO, I'd say you're crazy. So it has united the rest of Europe. And secondly, in my meetings, I was meeting with German ministers from the Social Democratic Party, which is equivalent to the Labour Party, and the Greens. And the German Greens are renowned for being anti-war, disarmament. They were the most fiercely committed to increasing German defence spending by 100 billion euros to combat what is going on right now.
Just wondering as well when Australia will relocate or return the ambassador to Kiev.
Yeah, look, this is something that we're constantly reviewing. It's a really complex and challenging area, and there's a real series
of course, we moved to Poland.
We moved to Poland, so there's operational, logistical, security and safety things you have to take into account. Importantly, the ambassador's in Warsaw. We've got full diplomatic and consular support for the 50-odd Australians or Australian permanent residents and their families that are still in Ukraine. So they're getting full support out of Warsaw. But ultimately, the safety of our workers has to be paramount.
Could I
and that's what's driving that decision.
Could I come in on that, please, Stan? And, you know, I hear what you say, Pat, but the fact is that we withdrew our embassy from Kyiv to Warsaw as soon as before the invasion occurred, when the invasion was imminent, as most countries did to various other locations in Western Europe. Most of those countries have sent their ambassadors back in. And President Zelenskyy has asked that we send our ambassador back into Kyiv, as most of the countries that withdrew did. Now, in Australia's case in particular, there's just no excuse for not sending the ambassador and the DFAT personnel back in. The Australian embassy in Kyiv was co-located with the Canadian embassy. The Canadians are back in. So what is being asked of us, and what we should do, is do the very thing the Canadians have done and reoccupy the very building that they have reoccupied.
Well, I can understand that. The decision to relocate the embassy was made by your government for good reason, and those good reasons still remain. Ultimately, we are responsible for the safety of those workers, and we have to make decisions based on that. We're reviewing it constantly, but importantly, all the consular assistance is occurring from Poland, but also, quite frankly, this is about how we show support for Ukraine. And symbolism matters, but so does $500 million
Would you like to see Australia's ambassador return to Kiev?
Well, you've heard the Ukrainian president being asked this question, and you heard what he answered.
And that's so your view too?
All I can, of course, I can only reiterate what my president said. I mean, this is as far as I can comment on that because it's already in the public domain. But what I actually wanted to elaborate a bit is actually on that training in Britain that the Australian government is helping with. I would like to personally thank Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles and Foreign Minister Penny Wong on actually being there, going there and meeting those soldiers. Let me just explain to you why it's so important. I think that personal connection between the Australian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers, they're going to come back, they're going to be rotated, they're going to share these stories. And I think Australia traditionally has been always there fighting for what is right. And this is one of those things. And I think, you know, asking a question of how do we go this year? it's all about a plan. We need a plan for this year. And I look forward to working with Australian government, facilitating communication, that we can have a plan, how much of that assistance could be provided, what could be provided, and we need to know what's happening, what's coming from our other partners. So I think this is a very important plan, because last year it was a bit ad hoc. Nobody knew how it was going to go. It was all about defending the country. But now we have to get all united with all the Ukrainian partners and come up with a big plan.
Okay. Just hold that thought, because we got a lot more to talk about. I want to go to the topic of our online poll, and it does reflect Jamie's question. We're asking you, should Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy be prepared to compromise with Russia to end the war? Now, of course, you can cast your votes on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. We'll bring you those results a little bit later. A lot to get to. Here's Shane Normoyle.
America has a tendency to do over their allies. Why should we expect this time to be any different?
I'll give that to the American on the panel, Senator.
Well, I think, first off, the United States recognizes that our national security is inextricably linked with the trust that our allies have in us. And I think for the United States, for the American people, the reality is that Australia and the United States have fought together through major world wars, World War I, World War II, the Gulf War. And I think for us, for our government, for our public, we see Australia as a sister country, a country that shares culture and language and history, and countries for whom our destinies are inextricably linked. And so what I would say is that our country, both our government and our people, are committed.
I think Shane was also getting to the point, Shane, if I'm reading you rightly, about America's ongoing support for Ukraine. Is that right?
For Ukraine.
If we look at the Afghanistan experience, for instance, there are a lot of people in Afghanistan, Sharan Burrow is nodding to the Sharon, I'll put it to you, who may have been saying, where are the Americans now?
Well, mistakes have been made by many nations, including, of course, the US, around foreign policy initiatives. And as somebody who, spent a sleepless set of weeks trying to get people out of Afghanistan, I don't personally believe that the speed and the haste and the lack of security for Afghanistan people, particularly women. But I could say similar things about other countries in regard to Syria, where we've still got ongoing conflicts. There are, in fact, if you go to 2014, then you could actually look back, and I think Angela Merkel admitted this, that in 2014, when the agreement was struck around those territories, the work that should have gone on.
Donetsk, Luhansk.
The
Minsk agreement you're talking about.
Yes,
right.
The work that should have gone on, that was part of that treaty, didn't. And so, in that context, yes, you can look at foreign policy mistakes, but can I say, it's now intractable. And as somebody who has had members in Russia, fantastically brave members in Ukraine, who I'm very proud of, even though I've just stepped down from my former role, they're still part of the family I love, then I can tell you that this is intractable. Anybody who's met Putin, sat down with him...
Which you have.
Yes, several times.
Do you want to share that experience with us?
Well,
what you could glean from that, at least.
I've met Putin a number of times, and I would have said there was narcissism there for sure. And, I don't think that's disputed. But now, this is a man who does not know how to engage. So while all wars should come to an end, and I think, Professor Brandis now was actually alluding to the fact that peace scenarios are always to be encouraged. But seeing this man in operation, and I once stood on a stage with him co-launching a union conference where I understood things I hadn't before, with his absolute vitriol against the West. Now, you can debate whether some of those things are right or wrong, but the vitriol was visceral in hatred. So while none of us could have predicted the invasion until those few months before, nevertheless, this is not a man who's going to back down while ever he's in power. And it's really a threat to the freedom, the democracy, the systems that we all care about.
I'll just say, and I appreciate the clarification on the question because I heard us, so I assumed you were talking about Australia. I think one of the important notes that I want to make sure I stress here is that Afghanistan, after 20 years, did not have a government that was able to govern its country, that it was able to amass the kind of power, monopoly on violence to be able to maintain the peace. And after 20 years of U.S. intervention there, the reality was nothing was going to change. Whereas what we have seen already in Ukraine and what we continue to see is not only a people that are standing up to Vladimir Putin, but a government that is fully capable of governing the nation, of not just repelling and protecting the people, but of actually maintaining the peace when peace does come.
That may also be an argument for staying in Afghanistan, isn't it, to protect people because they don't have a government to protect them?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the reality is that nothing was going to change. And so I think the president made a prudent decision to say, we have to be responsible about where we're exercising American intervention. And in this case, the circumstances on the ground just did not call for us to
Let's go quickly to the ambassador on that. Yeah.
So, elaborate on the 2014. This is exactly what has happened. Putin invaded Ukraine, grabbed Crimea, occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, and the reaction was pretty weak. Sanctions were imposed, but they were not strong enough. European countries continued trading with Russia, building and finishing the pipelines to supply gas. The leverage was growing. And in a way, Putin figured that if he could do it, and he was allowed to do it, he can probably go and invade Ukraine entirely. Get it done in 3 days, and everybody's just going to accept it. What he didn't actually expect, well, he didn't expect that huge resistance coming from Ukraine and the resilience and unity of the West in helping Ukraine. What he's now betting on is actually for you to get tired of that, tired of war, you know, volatility on the commodity markets, surging prices for gas and whatnot, and everybody will get tired and will say, oh, sit down, we have to come up to some sort of solution. But there could be only one solution. That solution should be on Ukrainian terms, and that solution should respect full sovereignty of Ukraine. That's the solution we are looking for.
Hold that thought. We'll continue the discussion. Bill Bowman has a question. Bill?
With Australia proceeding with the AUKUS arrangements, with heavy reliance on the US and the UK for both hardware and ongoing operation of critical defence infrastructure, is it realistic to think that Australia will be able to maintain its sovereignty and independence of action at a time of future military confrontation?
I'll bring you back in, George Brandis, on this, because there is a way of pulling all of those threads together, isn't there? What is Australia's interests in the region, our security, our relationship and reliability of that relationship with big allies, and how much we have to do on our own?
Thank you, Stan. This is another area, of course, in which there is strong bipartisanship in the Australian Parliament. And one thing that both sides of politics are united on is their absolute firmness that there should be no compromise to Australia's sovereignty as a result of the AUKUS Pact. Now, this is a tripartite pact between three nations. It involves immense complexities. It's not just about submarines. There is the second part, the so-called Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which commits the nations to jointly developing and operating a range of other capabilities, including undersea warfare, non-submarine undersea warfare, artificial intelligence, hypersonics, quantum computing, and so on. But coming to what gets everybody's attention at the moment about AUKUS, that is the nuclear-powered submarine dimension, the Pillar 1 dimension. It is possible, and Australia has stipulated emphatically that we can participate in the development and operation of these submarines without the violation of Australian sovereignty. Now, I know there are some, like Malcolm Turnbull, for example, who have challenged that. But ultimately, these are decisions for the Australian government of the day, whether it be a Labor government or a Liberal government. And of course, when there are joint operations and where there is the joint development of capabilities, there has to be a degree of cohesion between the participating countries. But that to say that is not to say that the sovereignty of any of the participating countries is compromised. It's merely to say that there are joint operational protocols which necessitate cooperation.
I'll go to Pat Conroy on this as well, and I suppose it also raises the question of our sovereign defence capacity. That I know we're increasing our military spending, but are we increasing it enough? Are we investing in the right things that we can be more independent and not have to necessarily rely on others like the US and the UK, although obviously they're going to be ongoing close relationships?
Well, thanks, Stan, and thank you, Bill, for your original question. On the broader question, before the budget, we'll release the Defence Strategic Review and the government's response to it, and I'm confident in saying it'll be the most significant defence policy document since the 1986 DIB White Paper, which reshaped defence. That'll include, obviously, our investment priorities. So that will be seminal. On your broader question about AUKUS, Australia faces the most challenging strategic circumstances since 1945, and I say that honestly and truthfully.
Because of China's rise?
So our national security since 45 has been based on three things: a strong alliance with the United States, secondly, being the partner of choice in the South Pacific, and thirdly, having a 10-year warning horizon for any major regional conflict. The 2020 Defence Strategic Update released by the last government was correct in saying that 10-year warning horizon has vanished. We no longer have a 10-year warning time for a major regional conflict.
Are you on a war footing then? Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't use words like war footing, but what I would say is we need to speed up our acquisition cycle. We need to get better at producing and buying weapons, and we need to be more agile about technology sharing, and that's what AUKUS is about. AUKUS can be boiled down to two concepts: sharing technologies to advance our collective security and growing our joint industrial capability to produce more platforms to defend Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. And the nuclear-powered submarine is at the heart of that. This will be the greatest capability that the Australian Defence Force ever receives. They are incredibly significant. They are incredibly vital for the security of our nation.
It's also a long way into the future.
But what I can assure you of, it'll take a while to build them, absolutely. Our commitment is to build them.
Is there leasing in the short term? Are you looking at other alternatives to bring it forward?
So we're doing a couple of things. One, we're extending the life of the excellent Collins-class diesel-powered submarines. So we'll be extending the life of them by 10 years, and we'll be announcing the optimal pathway coming forward in the next couple of months. But to the heart of your question, Bill, which is about sovereignty, we will build them in Adelaide and we will have full operational control of them. An Australian captain will captain those submarines and they'll take orders from Canberra, nowhere else. And that's very important to assure people. And this is the case with other systems. For example, the Joint Strike Fighter, made in Fort Worth in Texas. 16 nations are part of it. We have full operational control of the 72 Joint Strike Fighters we have. The old Oberon-class submarines, built in the United Kingdom, captained by Australians, full operational control. So AUKUS is about growing our capability. I was in Burrow, England last week, where the UK builds their submarines. 11,500 workers building the most advanced capabilities.
But we're heading into entirely different territory with nuclear submarines, and we don't have the capacity right now to do what you're saying. So we're going to have to develop that. Sharan Burrow, I think you want to come in on this.
Well, I want to take us to the question of alliances. In a fractured world where, while we're rightfully focused on Ukraine and the global tragedy, as well as the personal tragedy for our Ukraine brothers and sisters, nevertheless, there are 58 other conflicts in the world. The military spend is as great as it was in World War II, if not greater. And yet I don't see enough attention to the partnership in all alliances, not just the AUKUS alliance, but all alliances around the common security for people. And if you think that, in fact, two-thirds of our trade is into Asia, only about 10% of our forward investments into Asia as an economy, then what are we doing to strengthen the capacity of our social contract with people that is an equal partner to security concerns? And I really think we shouldn't be talking about defence capability without actually looking at the questions of defending our people's capacity for the security they need.
Well, Sharon, on that, I couldn't agree more, and that's why this government's been incredibly energised on our international diplomatic efforts. I think led by the Prime Minister, but Penny Wong and other ministers who have responsibility like me in the Pacific have been re-engaging with the region of both the Indo-Pacific and broader. We've been engaging on climate change. We've been focusing on ASEAN. We've been focusing on really reintroducing Australia to the rest of the world, because you're absolutely right. Security is a much broader concept than just military hardware. That is essential, but also diplomatic engagement with the rest of the world is critical as well.
Ambassador, I'll just come to you in a sec. I wanted to come to you, Senator, on this. I know you talked before about the indivisible relationship between Australia and the United States, but I'm wondering how Americans may see this. How front of mind is a country like Australia to Americans?
I would say that Australia is fairly front of mind. I think Americans recognize the unique role that Australia plays, particularly in this region. I think that Americans view Australia, as I mentioned before, as a sister country. And so I do believe that when AUKUS was announced, Americans who did take note of it were thrilled to see a deepening of that relationship and the United States stepping up to further support a critical ally.
Well, Russian invasion of Ukraine has reinvigorated defense and security alliances. There was no better promoter for NATO than Vladimir Putin. And the unity we're seeing there, you know, this is what is there. Look, also this war has exposed defense industry. We see that their stockpiles are low, and the defense industry cannot keep up with the production, or actually they phased out production a long time ago because they never thought they would need that ammunition or stockpiles. But now we need to look at it from a different point of view. But also, I would like to say that this war is different from all other wars in the world. Firstly, because it's waged by a nuclear power. It's waged by a country which is a permanent member of the United Nations, which we question, because nobody ever voted for Russia to be in the as a permanent member.
UN Security Council.
Yes, exactly. Security Council of the United Nations, and also what's important, because if Russia wins, that's going to undermine the entire international world order, right? It's really credibility of the Security Council will be gone. The respect for UN Charter is gone, because what Russia has done, which is so different from any other war, they've really done the large-scale invasion which the world has not seen since the Second World War.
And Stan,
I think we have to move on. I know that you've both made some points, but we'll have to move on. We're going to come back to this and stay with this conversation. If you are just joining us, you're watching Q&A live with Sarah McBride, Pat Conroy, Vasyl, Myroshnychenko, Sharan Burrow and George Brandis. Of course, we have many Ukrainian Australians here tonight, and we know that people are feeling this very personally, very directly, and have family in Ukraine as well. I want to introduce one of them to you now, Alexandra Lunova. Nice to have you with us. How long have you been in Australia?
11 months.
11 months. And you are a social psychologist, is that right?
Yes, I have this degree in Ukraine.
And what's been your experience as you listen to this conversation? You talk to other Ukrainians here. What is your experience of the conflict, having left, and living with what we're seeing playing out each day?
Okay, so what I can to say, a lot of Ukrainians have lost everything, and for those of us who found refuge here in Australia, that's a little bit like living in limbo, because we are humanitarian visa holders, temporary humanitarian visa holders
so
for 3 years.
What does that mean if you're a humanitarian? And we know that the cut-off for that ended as well last year, didn't it, to apply for humanitarian visas? What does that mean for you when you talk about being in limbo? What can you and can you not do with a humanitarian visa?
So we have, a lot of our visas will be expired in the middle of the, approximately June, July 2025. And we don't know what to expect next, what we will do after this.
You have a question as well for our panel?
Yes, I have a question. So first of all, I want to say a lot of thanks for all support which provide Australia to our community. Thank you very much. And I have a question. So our humanitarian program is closed. We can't bring here our parents or our partners. A lot of Ukrainians which already here near or over 45 years old, and because of current migration legislation, they have near zero chances to stay here for a long period or permanently. But at the same time, this group of people, the most skilled, the most educated, the most experienced. And my question is, so how we can plan our life in these circumstances with a temporary humanitarian visa, and what waiting us in the future here in Australia?
Pat Conroy.
Thank you for the question. It was Alexandra?
Alexandra,
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you for the question. And my heart just breaks about what you and your nation are going through. I'm very happy to get your details afterwards and talk to the relevant minister about it. But obviously the government will have to make a decision as that timeline approaches about what happens. We have a general principle of not sending people back to areas where they can suffer harm, but it'd be inappropriate for me to comment specifically on our decision.
It's not just about sending people back, as Alexandra said, it's about family.
Yeah.
It's about being reunited with family. And we've heard tonight the prospect of a longer conflict. So will you revisit, will you reopen people being able to apply for humanitarian visas? Will you look at relaxing restrictions or opening up the possibility of being reunited with family members? What assurances can you give, Alexandra, who's asked you a very direct question about that?
It's incredibly direct and a very reasonable question, and I completely understand that. So I'm not here to make a policy announcement on the run, but what I can say to you is three things. One, the government will obviously consider this scenario and answer that question about those timelines. Secondly, we do have our regular asylum seeker intake that is there. And third, we've increased our permanent migration numbers to a bit over 190,000 each year from, I think, it's about 160,000 under the last government. So we've created space in our migration system for more people to settle in this country, including asylum seekers, through our established process. But I want to get an answer for you rather than making an answer on the run. But your question is really legitimate.
It's a very, very real issue, though, not just here in Australia, but in all the neighbouring countries and countries throughout Europe, I suspect even into the US, although I don't know the figures directly. But the family issue and the choice, the security of choice and the family issue, and I'm sure Pat understands this, is the critical issue, because most of the refugees are women and children. So they've not only lost contact with parents, grandparents, other members of their family, but most of the husbands and brothers are actually still fighting in Ukraine. Understandable, but just imagine the human trauma of the breakup of those families.
Well, we have people experiencing that. And Alexandra, you've heard the answer from the Minister tonight.
Yeah.
Are you happy with the answer?
Yes, but I hope we will proceed this issue forward.
And it's really important.
But for now, thank you for your answers. Thank you.
Vasyl, what are you looking for from the Australian government?
Look, we have 5 million refugees in Europe. We have another 9 million who are internally displaced. Russians are destroying our energy infrastructure, destroying power generation, power distribution, destroying schools, hospitals, bombing cultural UNESCO heritage buildings, religious buildings. Devastation is huge. Of course, we're all interested in making sure that this war ends, it ends on our terms, and we can rebuild the country, get all those people back. But for the time being, we're very grateful for all those countries who are hosting our people temporarily within their borders, including Australia. There are only about 7,000 Ukrainians who were able to come here, and I'm sure Australia could probably take more. But at the same time, if we look at the scale of the issue, Poland has 1.5 million Ukrainians. Germany is hosting almost 1 million. Britain is hosting over 100,000 Ukrainians. So the numbers are huge, and the scale of the problems there is much bigger. Yeah.
I might bring George Brandis in. I mean, you've listened to what Alexandra's had to say, obviously, and where the government's at. Is there something more that can be done right now, in your view?
Well, obviously, we would all, from a purely human point of view, wish that we could do more. This is a decision for government, and I really aren't in a position to expand beyond what Pat has said. But I mean, the Australian people, public as I'm sure you have experienced in your own case, and in the case of people in your situation, has been extremely generous to people from Ukraine, as we're a generous people. We are a people who do, when people in your situation need help, give them help. And it is a matter for the government to make this call, but the sentiment of the Australian public, I think you've seen for yourself.
And one thing that's really important, and I think everyone would agree with, is that we provide the maximum support for Ukrainians in this country who've gone through a hugely traumatic experience, family separation, death, war. I've got Ukrainian refugees in my electorate. I run a Christmas card competition, for example, where school kids draw a Christmas card in the winter that goes out to everyone. And last year's theme was Christmas in the Outback. So all the kids were drawing Santa Claus in front of Uluru. And I had a young girl in stage 2 called Maria from Ukraine. She'd never seen the Outback. So she drew what she saw as Christmas, which is a white Christmas. And we put that on the card proudly as a symbol of our support, but also a symbol of our further support for the people here.
Alexandra, good luck. Good luck to you and to your family as well. Thank you again for your question. Our next question is for US State Senator Sarah McBride. It's from Antigone Marchbank.
Hi there.
Hi.
As someone who has many trans friends, it is very heartening to see someone who is able to live their truth and is doing so much to ensure the safety and rights of trans people. What are some of the challenges you faced in getting to this position, and what more do you think needs to be done?
Sure. Well, first off, thank you for those incredibly kind comments. The ability to serve a community that I was born and raised in public office as my authentic self is the greatest professional privilege of my life. And I think one of the greatest challenges in getting there was simply having the courage to reimagine a world that didn't exist. They say it's hard to be what you can't see. And as a young person, the idea that a trans person could serve in public office seemed so impossible to me that it was almost incomprehensible. And so I am incredibly grateful that I've had the opportunity to not only witness that kind of change firsthand, but to be able to live it. Unfortunately, though, my experience remains unique for trans people, not just in the United States, but around the world. And the work of the LGBTQ movement, the work that we're recommitting ourselves here at World Pride to in Sydney this week, is the work to ensure that no matter where you live, no matter who you love, no matter what gender you identify with, that you can live your truth and dream big dreams all at the same time. Right now in the United States, we are facing an exceptional backlash to the progress that we've made on LGBTQ rights writ large, but specifically on trans rights. I think one of the challenges that people have when we're talking about transgender people is that most people who aren't trans don't know what it feels like to have a gender identity that differs from your sex assigned at birth. When we're talking about sexual orientation, most people understand what it feels like to love and to lust, and so they're able to enter into that conversation with an analogous experience. And for me, the closest thing that I could compare being trans and in the closet to was just a constant feeling of homesickness. And fortunately, I was able to alleviate that homesickness. I was able to find home in myself and in my soul. But what I think we're here at World Pride recognizing is that as much as we can find home in ourselves, we still yearn for a home in our physical world, where we can be loved and embraced as who we are. And this backlash that's occurring is really targeting, in particular, transgender young people. And across the country, particularly in states that are controlled by Republican politicians, they have decided to score political points on the backs of vulnerable young people. It is cruel, it is unconscionable, and it is dangerous. Lives are literally on the line right now. But for me, what gives me hope in this moment as we continue to face those attacks is that the story of the LGBTQ community around the world is the story of people opening hearts and changing minds, even in the face of hatred, of building movements and structures in the face of unimaginable loss through the HIV and AIDS epidemic, of having conversations in the United States and here in Australia when marriage equality was on the ballot here and before the Supreme Court in the United States, that laid the foundation for marriage equality in both of our nations, something that would have seemed impossible decades before. And so what I have learned is that every single time they come for us, we end up growing stronger. And I know that in my lifetime, we will continue to move equality forward, and we will beat this backlash, because the moment they come for us, the moment they start this conversation, it might work politically for a brief period of time. But once people start to make the connection between a vulnerable community and humanity, it ends up starting the clock on the effectiveness of that politics. And they end up sowing the seeds of the destruction of the politics of hate that they seek to implement. And so I am hopeful. I'm hopeful because of the change I've witnessed and experienced, but I'm more hopeful because of the community that I'm a part of that has continued to turn pain into progress.
Sharan, just picking up on what Sarah had to say there more globally, and of course you're involved in a lot of this in your previous role as well, in looking at where is the work still to be done, in looking at defending and progressing the rights of people.
Everywhere, Stan, everywhere. And that's why, not just for Sydney, but Australia to host World Pride is an extraordinary outpouring of support and love. I mean, Senator, you are an inspiration. You're an incredible leader, and people working with you would respect you absolutely for who you are and your courage. But I can tell you that, you know, we've had to get people out of countries who are going to be executed for being, you know, queer community activists. We've had to actually find them positions that were safe in another country. I'm not just talking about being discriminated against, I'm talking about being executed. And so it goes from this end of the spectrum to that end of the spectrum. And when we embrace hate because we're frightened of difference, then it is the children who grow up with no sense that they are part of a humankind, an actual community. A long time ago, I was a teacher and passionate about the role of education in dignity and equality and justice. Can you imagine that there are communities today who still vest hatred and discrimination on children who themselves are struggling, as Sarah said, to actually live with their own identity, and their parents are struggling to figure out how to support them? All I can say is I just wanted to pay tribute, but I did want to say this is unfinished business on a human rights front, and I mean human front, everywhere.
George Brandis, you were, of course, a central figure in the debate around marriage equality in the Parliament Attorney General at the time. What is the role of politics? And just listening to what the Senator had to say about the backlash in the United States, what is the role of politics and political leaders in this moment?
Well, before I answer that, can I just say how inspiring I found those remarks of yours, Senator? I mean, that was a magnificent testament, if I may say so. One of the things I did in my political career that I'm proudest of was the day Malcolm Turnbull and I signed the marriage equality bill into law in December 2017. And Stan, you asked, what is the role of politics? Well, you know, it's all about politics because it's only through the political system that you achieve these outcomes.
And yet we're also hearing what's happening with the backlash in the United States specifically.
That's politics too, but politics is always a contested space. And that doesn't mean that people who might disagree with you are wrong or that you're more virtuous than people who have a different point of view. You have to acknowledge that politics is a contested space. And when
you did say that people have a right to be bigots at one time in your career. Do you now regret something?
I don't, because I absolutely not, because
they have a right to be bigots?
It is of the essence of a free society that people have the right to be whatever they want to be, as long as it's not against the law. And if we're not going to have a free society unless we respect the right of people to have views we might find loathsome, we can find the views loathsome, but respect their right to hold those views, because that's what a free society is. Now, to come back to your first... Now, to come back to your initial question, Stan, The reason politics is so important, the reason in one way or another, everyone on this panel, and perhaps the ambassador in an international dimension, but all of us in one way or another have devoted so much of our lives to politics, is that we have identified that that is the contested space in which achievement and improvements can be accomplished, but not without a struggle. And that's your point, Senator. Not without a struggle, but the struggle is worth having.
And if this discussion is raising any difficulties as well for you or anyone, of course, close to you or people you know, let's have a look at those numbers there on your screen. Of course, you can call those numbers if you need. We'll go to Vera Myroshnychenko now.
Dobry večer, Ambassador. Putin is now announcing his war is against LGBTQI people as well as Nazis in the West. His propaganda videos this weekend that I saw suggested President Zelenskyy is gay. What is Ukraine's legal stand on LGBTQI people, citizens of Ukraine, and has public opinion changed since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991?
This is a great question. Thank you very much. Indeed, in their Kremlin propaganda, Putin and Russia is painting Europe as a decadent and gay Europe, as they call it. So actually this anti-LGBT kind of narrative has been coming out of Russia for the past 10 years or even more. And I recently had an honor to be at the opening of the World Pride here with the Lord Mayor and the local politicians, and I talked more about it. And for us, a country which is aspiring to join the European Union, inclusivity, equity, human rights are fundamental. We have gay and lesbians who are now in the trenches fighting. We also have the representatives from the Kyiv Pride who came here, and they probably will be at the same conference where the senator speaks. And for us, it's all about that value and equity and justice that people can be whoever they want to be. And you should look at our war from that standpoint of view, that we are out there for those European values, for those human rights. And that's a very important question that you're asking. And of course, Ukraine traditionally has been a very conservative country. And
of course, there are still laws against same-sex marriage.
Yes.
Is that likely to change?
It's likely to change. Actually, President Zelenskyy was asked this question last summer by the CNN, and he actually provided a positive answer to that. He said, we are working on that, and we want to get it legalized. And of course, it's a big step forward, because I have to be frank, Ukraine is still a very conservative country. But if you compare it with Russia and what's happening in Russia, these are two different worlds. And I think those members of the LGBTQ community who are now fighting or supporting Ukraine in the fight against Russia, they're the symbol of that struggle, and that's part of their aspiration to be who they want to be and to achieve inclusivity in Ukraine as part of as a member of the European Union eventually.
I think the question of human rights, you have to separate from our total solidarity about peace for Ukraine. You're right about Russia and its intolerance, not just to indeed the LGBTQ community, but indeed to refugees, to women, still on many fronts, to a whole range of human rights issues. But I would say we also are glad to see the accession of Ukraine being considered into the European Union, because there's laws around labour rights, other areas of human rights that the ambassador's right are still, in fact, to be resolved. Europe itself, by the way, not just Ukraine, but many other countries in Europe, are still actually dealing with some of these discriminatory, often deeply embedded discriminatory laws, and indeed the xenophobia or the discrimination that comes with those. So there's still work to be done, as I said, everywhere. But we wouldn't want to say that Ukraine and its laws are perfect. We do want to say that the people of Ukraine have our hearts, and with accession into the EU to deepen that project of peace and rights and equality, then we're very optimistic.
Let's go to our results of our poll now. Let's go back to that. Of course, we asked you, should Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy be prepared to compromise with Russia to end the war? Overwhelmingly no. 73%, 21% yes, and 6% unsure. Ambassador, when you look at that poll, what does that say to you about the level of resolve, and what is still prepared, what is still required here to either get a victory or to bring an end to the conflict?
Look, I think this is a very clear answer to why Australian government is supporting Ukraine. Why two successive governments were supporting Ukraine? Because Australian people believe that it's the right thing to do. You were standing up for the underdog. You were inspired by the courage Ukrainians are facing and that resilience that we're demonstrating. And it's important that that support is sustained and that we can come up to a plan to have more of that support coming, especially given all the surveys that we're seeing that support is out there. And I think for any politician, there is no better answer to why we should support Ukraine, but look at these numbers.
Overwhelming number. Yeah, it is indeed. We're going to finish tonight's discussion now. I think you're going to like this. I don't know. You know, depending on the answers here. We'll go to Eva Paliavi.
Well, good evening, everybody. I have a question concerning spying. And there was recently detected a spy hive, Russian spy hive in Australia. And this detection was done by ASIO, the Australian Security Service. And I now wonder, Stan and all of you panelists, that have you ever felt that there is somebody spying on you? Somebody standing behind your shoulder? You have yet anyway access to very interesting, very often very important information which could be of use to any foreign spies here.
Eva, I lived in China as a reporter for 10 years. I can tell you I didn't have to wonder.
Yeah, exactly.
They were parked outside my house.
Exactly. Yeah.
George Brandis.
Well, I was as the Attorney General, was the minister responsible for ASIO. So in my day, so. Of course. Does
that mean ASIO was looking over your shoulder?
No. ASIO is terrific. So, but of course, in a position like that, you're very conscious that you are a person of interest to potentially hostile foreign powers. This Russian nest of spies in Australia is, of course, a great historical theme in this country, going back all the way to 1954 and the famous Petrov incident. So, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Pat Conroy.
Well, it's an interesting story, and I certainly feel like when you're in the public gaze, you always have to be careful. And the story about going overseas, it reminds me, when I travel to certain countries, you're not allowed to take your electronics. They give you an old Nokia, sorry for the product placement, which is good because I like to play the snake gun. So it's good. So you're not allowed on any of your electronic devices. You take a Nokia, you make your phone calls. When you come back to the country, they have a very high-tech solution to get rid of it. They hit it with a hammer. It's just wasted. So you have to be careful as a minister or a member of parliament because it's ultimately the nation's secrets that you're guarding, not your own.
Sarah, in the United States as well, do you feel as if you're sometimes, someone might be watching you, looking over your shoulder? Are there any precautions that you might take just in case?
Well, I'm not hiding anything. So, but, I think what is oftentimes really jarring is you will think about something and maybe even have a conversation. Your phone might not even be around. And then you get the advertisement for whatever.
Is your phone listening to you?
Yes, right. And so I don't know if foreign powers are spying on me, but corporations trying to sell me things seem to be spying on me. I think that this question, though, really reinforces something that I think is one of the greatest public policy questions that we're facing right now, which is an unregulated internet is a much easier internet where you can spy on people. And the lack of meaningful regulation of the internet, the fact that it's essentially a wild, wild west, opens it up to significant abuse, whether we're talking about private actors or foreign powers.
Ambassador, what precautions do you take right now? Because, we can have a laugh about some of the things, but of course, in the situation that you're in, you must be very conscious.
Yeah, absolutely. I take my personal safety and security very seriously, especially in the role that I am. But generally, spycraft has changed with the technology. And in today's world, we see how technology could be used for good purpose, could be used for a bad purpose, for different ways. But I think what's important, we see a lot of that increasing activity of this malign foreign influence, where actually countries like Russia can undermine democracy. They know how to do it. They exploit your weaknesses. They know how to use freedom of speech to push their narratives and to push their propaganda. They can undermine, they can hack your Medicom system and release private information on people. They can hack your telecommunications. And this cybersecurity and cyber threats are big, but it could be, you know, very pernicious impact of how you could be undermined through that malign foreign influence, and how Russia's actually doing it.
Sharan.
But it's not just Russia. I mean, I think all nations use the technology, and before the technology, I mean, for those of us who are old enough to have been anti-Vietnam War activists, I think ASIO had files on many of us. You can't have been...
So you expect they had one on you?
I'm sure. Although I was very young in those days, so maybe I escaped the worst of it. But as the leader of the global labour movement, I can tell you surveillance is everywhere. Like, you don't go into a country and fight for human and labour rights, fight for people and justice and freedom, and not be under surveillance. But that's not what I'm worried about. As leaders, we expect that, and you take precautions. You know, you can't escape it. I'm sure most of us have had attacks over time. I certainly have. But I'm worried about the level of surveillance on people. You know, we can make jokes now about ASIO, but Sarah's point about corporation is humorous at one level, but it's insidious. For workers in workplace, the level of surveillance equals oppression. So we need brave politicians to actually legislate. I'm not sure about the internet. Sarah could have a debate about how to regulate that, because I think corporate interests are right in there. But nevertheless, we do need to make sure that people still have some privacy that they can actually depend on.
Eva, thank you so much for your question. That's all we have time for. Thanks again to our panel, Sarah McBride, Pat Conroy, Vasyl Myroshnychenko, Sharan Burrow and George Brandis. Please thank them. Thank you as well for sharing your questions. I'll be with you live from Melbourne next week. We're going to be discussing free speech, which we spoke a little bit about tonight, the monarchy, and the hard questions we face around the voice to Parliament. Joining me, British playwright Sir David Hare, Wiradjuri and Whale One lawyer Teela Reid, author and behavioural scientist Pragya Agarwal, Assistant Minister for the Republic Matt Thistlethwaite, and Liberal Senator for New South Wales Andrew Bragg. Go to our website and you can register there to be in the audience. Until then, have a good night. Thank you.